The Viking series for White Wellbeing, Episode 1, A Fury is Born. We find ourselves in the year 772 AD. We are on the verge of an event in history branded as the Saxon Wars, or perhaps the War for Saxon Independence. You may wonder where it all began, and here is where I will begin. In parts of modern-day France, there was an ambitious monarch. His name? Charlemagne, meaning Charles the Great. Or so his moniker goes. And victors, well, they do like to write history, preferably in favor of themselves, if it can be helped. Let us in brief go over his rulership first, just to get a sense of who he was, for you to get a sense who he was. We know that he united the Frankish tribes into a unified empire, or kingdom, whichever you prefer. Much like the fallen Roman Empire, such were his ambitions. He wanted rulership over the world. That much seems evident. But how would he begin? Where to start if you want to set yourself up to be a leader of the world? He enforced public schooling to begin with. For the Frankish nobility at first, those that supported him, they were taught to read, write and talk in Latin, the global language of the day. This had many reasons, of course. It created an educational and information gap between what you might call the aristocracy of the time and the commoners, the peasantry if you will. And such a thing helps with maintaining control over them. It will allow for wide-ranging communications with the papacy in Italy. Why the papacy? Because that in turn makes it easier for the exchange of power that was had between Charlemagne's regime and the papacy itself. What was the deal? Charlemagne's regime would spread Christian influence over the mostly still Franks that would still hold on to their local version of native European spirituality. To force convert the Franks, his own people, he made it possible to legally pursue dissenters in that fashion. You disagree with his tax policy? You must stand in the way of Charlemagne's divine, God-given right to rule, and be punished. You did not want to wage war for the ambitions of one man? Clearly you were a heathen that sided with the others across the border, and again be punished. And by taking away their native spiritual identity, his regime had now room to force his own in place. That of a proper Frankish Christian, the Christian man, in service to Charlemagne's empire. And it did not come without great rewards, of course, if you fought for him. Now where would that wealth come from? You might wonder. How could someone be lured through wealth that way? Well, one way is to have an ally, such as the papacy, which is very wealthy, has a lot of connections all over the world, and send you support, because you are spreading the influence that they want over the world too. And that is one of the reasons I believe that makes sense, how the Frankish Empire became as powerful as it did so quickly. Because there was a lot of outside support that many locals from other, at the time you might call nations or kingdoms, could not receive. We know that Charlemagne's regime fought many wars during his lifetime. The papacy and Charlemagne were old allies since the wars with the Lombards and their king Desiderius, and this was in the year 773 and 774. But now Charlemagne's ambitions after his victory against his father-in-law, indeed, stretched to the lands of the Saxons. Sparks that set off the excuse for this war, there are many. I know that that Charlemagne's father Pepin waged war against the Saxons too. I think that is also how Charlemagne first came to know of them as enemies to wage war against. And there were also cases where churches were built illegally on Saxon land. Of course the Saxons would take that down, but now there was a reason for the, you might say, uninformed masses to feel anger towards these heathen Saxons, for they destroyed houses of God. But we're gonna come to the year 771 and 772 AD again. It truly starts off with Charlemagne's army besieging a place called Eresburg, a base now to be used by the Franks. It is here also that the symbol of importance to the Saxons called the Irminsul was destroyed and replaced with a cross, a sacred native European symbol destroyed. I am pretty sure that went around Europe quick enough. And thus the remaining population that stayed near Eresburg was force converted. Now that all the fighting men there were dead, it left a lot of room for preachers to go in and I suppose pray upon or towards the locals. An earl named Theodoric would be given administrative control of the area. And since the Lombards began their uprising, which I just described happened in the next year, as well as other interesting events in Spain taking place, Charlemagne decided that with no lack of booty, no lack of war loot, which is also a way for those who fought for him to get rich real quickly, he left off. But Theodoric soon would realize that the Saxons would not stand for this affront to their people. In response to the destruction of the Irminsul, many churches and monasteries were emptied out and deconstructed. These responses to Charlemagne's brutalities continued, and at about 779 AD, the Saxon hero was allowed to lead his people, a man going by the name Widukind or Wittekind, a name meaning child of the woods, or perhaps white child. His nickname was Duke of the Saxons. Now why is that his nickname? Because he was probably a chosen war leader, as is an old folk custom, where you choose a leader in times of need, and then when the war is over, you don't need such leaders anymore. So there is little chance of corruption. I thought it was interesting to add. 3 years after he became more well known during this war, the Saxons regained a kind of hope. They did away with the yoke of Charlemagne and the church. Widukind avenged many atrocities by recapturing garrisoned land by Charlemagne's loyalists. It seemed to go well for the Saxons, really. Around 782 AD, A battle took place on the Shuntal. Theodoric knew the Saxons could not be allowed to form a professional army and planned Widukin's downfall. It was during this time, unfortunately, for I suppose the Frankish, that two important nobles, one called Adalgis and the other one called Gelo, however, that they did not share in the caution of Theodoric in dealing with the Saxons. Surely they were just peasants with pitchforks. Trained soldiers cannot lose against such. But at the Battle of the Shuntal, indeed, many Franks lost their lives on the battlefield, including these two nobles. Why they are specifically mentioned is a bit of a mystery, but I suppose they had some sort of importance and relevancy at the time that could not be simply wiped off the map, so to say. And indeed, that same year, after those deaths, Charlemagne returned. Now, what did he return for? That is the question, isn't it? The Saxons, after a decade of war, must have figured they had won. Time to have discourse with the beaten foe. Now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, you who are listening, and imagine yourself among the invited. You're there with friends and family, surrounded by the best of the best. The mood is high, you've come unarmed as was agreed upon. You gather at a place named Verdun. You hear marching feet and figure that they would be there with many, as you are, with over 4,000 men, most of them veterans of war by now. A man appears. Is it Charlemagne himself? A priest? Theodoric? You see them grab their weapons, and still filled with that damned European naivety and sense of honor, you figured they'll cast down their spears and swords, right? And then the man speaks. Swear fealty to God, swear fealty to the monarch, or be executed. And in that moment, you realize you all have been betrayed. And during the year 782 AD, an event will go into history by the name the Massacre of Verdun, where an estimated 4,200 men were either force converted, but truly were all executed. Under law of Charlemagne's regime, it would from then on go as, if any tribe of the Saxons hereafter concealed among them shall have wished to hide himself unbaptized, and shall have scorned to come to baptism, and shall have wished to remain pagan, let him be punished by death. And this can be found in the De Partibus Saxoniae. It is shortly thereafter that Charlemagne and continued to wage war against the Frisians, the Bavarians, and others truly. And at 796 AD, the Saxons resisted once again, actually, with the help of Slavic tribes that knew that what had transpired was unacceptable. During 796 and 798 AD, Charlemagne's regime decided to level the countryside, and at 799 AD, another massacre took place, where all military-aged men were killed, and the children were deported to Francia. And then his loyalists would get that land. And by this time the war was more or less really over. The confrontations in battle had severely lessened. There might have been a raid here and there. There might have been some guys in a bar who came over, who raised fisticuffs over all of that had transpired. But by 804 AD, a final sacking of Saxon territory took place. And since those lands were incorporated into the Regis Francorum, the Frankish kingdom. And this indeed strengthened Charlemagne's rule, as of course did it spread the papacy's influence. I thank you all for listening. I hope it was a bit of an educational and interesting story to all of you. I am going to continue making this series for the foreseeable future. I'm going to go now by as many names as I can chronologically. I hope you will all be keen to hear that. Now, why did I start here? This isn't about Vikings, right? For those who paid attention. And I will tell you. According to me, all the atrocities that took place during this war, the cultural shift, the religious shift that took place, as we also can see at the end of the war for Saxon independence, or the Saxon Wars, whichever you prefer, the neighboring tribes in Europe decided to come help the Saxons. And I believe that this is what started off what is called the Viking Age. The threat that the Frankish kingdom posed, the threat of native spirituality for Europeans to be erased, was a real thing. And those remaining who still held true to that, well, they were not going to stand for it. And little did the victors know that somewhere in the north a fury was born. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that it was fun. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I hope that you all found some value out of it. I'm going to mention real quickly that it is not my intention for you to just memorize what I said. I would appreciate it really far more that if you even forget a few parts of the story, but that you gain moral lessons out of it, that you learn to decide for yourself what here that took place is white positive or what was anti-white. What is there to learn from what these people did? Is there something to improve upon? Is there something to look down upon? Again, it's all for you to decide. That may seem a bit strange for a schooling project, but I actually think that this is what real schooling should be about, when it comes to history at least. We look at ourselves, how we used to be in the past. And why do we do that? Just for showing off that we know? I guess you can a little bit if you want that. But it is so we can look at ourselves in the past, so we can adjust ourselves accordingly in the present, so we can be better as a people tomorrow. We look at the past, we look at history, so we can continue to make history. And I was Hans Hugren. I really enjoyed making it. And with that said, I'm going to sign off, and bye-bye everyone.